Welcome back, everyone. Let's dive right in. In our last session, we introduced structuralism, and I know for some of you, the concepts felt a bit abstract or difficult to grasp. That is completely normal. Today, we are going to do a thorough review to ensure everyone is on the same page. Please, if you have any doubts, ask them. You deserve to fully understand this material, and your questions often help others who might be wondering the exact same thing. Let's start by contrasting structuralism with what we studied previously, structural functionalism. Structural functionalism was primarily concerned with how a social structure stabilizes over time. Structuralism, however, asks a fundamentally different question. It is not just interested in studying the existing structures in society. It wants to know what creates those structures. What is the underlying logic or rulebook that builds them in the first place?
The core premise of structuralism is that there is a universal thought process. Humans are essentially designed to think in a specific, universal manner. This means that the culture and social structures we see around us are actually the result of a pre-programmed code within the human mind. There is an internal logic motivating every individual to perceive and organize the world in a specific way. To understand this pre-programmed code, imagine wearing a pair of glasses that has tape placed across the lenses in a specific pattern. When you look through these glasses, your view of the entire world is shaped and constrained by that tape. Similarly, our senses are constantly bombarded with massive amounts of stimuli, but our brain categorizes and organizes this chaotic information using its own internal pattern. This idea didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was heavily influenced by Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology argues that human thought processes are inherently patterned. The vast amount of information entering our minds isn't left fragmented. Our brain actively organizes it. Furthermore, we take these internal mental patterns and impose them onto the outer world. The structure we see outside is actually a reflection of how our minds are organized. The second major influence is structural linguistics. This field views language as a complete system. In this system, individual parts or sounds don't mean much on their own. An element only acquires its meaning and identity when it is placed in a specific relationship with other elements. Let's look at a practical example of how elements depend on each other. Take the sequence of letters E-I-G-H-T. By itself, it's pronounced eight. Add an H and it becomes height. Add a W and it becomes weight. The sound and meaning of the core elements shift entirely depending on what they are attached to. There is no fixed, universal sound for these letters in isolation. Here is another classic example: tomb, comb, and bomb. They all share the exact same OMB ending, yet they are pronounced entirely differently. Structural linguistics uses this to prove that identity and meaning are strictly relational. The sound depends entirely on the surrounding context. Structural linguistics also points out that language is governed by hidden rules. When you say the word apple, you arrange sounds in a specific sequence that makes sense. Why that order? We are born with an innate capacity to use these hidden rules to create words and sentences. We use them unconsciously and flawlessly, even though we usually cannot articulate exactly what those rules are. Now, a great question came up regarding the psychic unity of mankind. In the context of structuralism, this means that all humans possess an equal thinking capacity. No group is intellectually superior or inferior. We all share the same fundamental mental architecture, which means we all universally categorize the world using binary opposites, like good versus evil, regardless of our specific society. This brings us to the pivotal thinker, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who took these linguistic concepts and applied them directly to culture. He argued that culture is exactly like language, driven by hidden rules we follow but cannot articulate. He stated they are homologous, meaning both are products of the human mind, and they correlate, meaning cultural elements, just like linguistic sounds, only derive meaning in relation to other elements. Most importantly, Lévi-Strauss stated that culture and language are analogous. The primary function of culture, just like language, is communication. Culture creates the mechanisms and the rules that allow individuals within a society to interact and exchange with one another. Lévi-Strauss proposed that in any society, this cultural communication happens at three distinct levels. First, the exchange of words and messages, governed by linguistic rules. Second, the exchange of goods and services, which we understand as the economy. And third, the exchange of women between families, which is governed by the rules of kinship and marriage. So how does this communication actually happen? It all goes back to the universal thought process, binary opposites.
Because our brains are wired to think in binaries, we naturally categorize people into groups, such as our own versus others. Culture then steps in to create rules for exchange between these distinct categories, and it is this very exchange that builds the social structure. Let's look at how this plays out in specific cultural practices. Moving right along, let us look deeper at how this underlying pattern of binary opposites actually builds social structures. Levi-Strauss argued that human thought naturally divides the world into us versus them, but to form a society, these opposing groups must interact. They do this through a mechanism of exchange, whether that is exchanging goods, services, or even people. This exchange bridges the gap between the binaries and creates a lasting social structure. Let us examine how this works in kinship, starting with the concept of a moiety. A moiety occurs when a tribal society is divided into two distinct halves. Here, we see a clear binary opposite. One group identifies itself as distinct from the other. To create a social bond, these moieties typically practice exogamy, meaning they exchange women for marriage. This exchange acts as the mode of communication that binds the two opposing halves together into a single functioning society. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule, such as the Toda tribe of the Nilgiri Hills. The Toda are divided into two moieties, the Tarthar and the Tevali, but they are endogamous. They marry strictly within their own group. So if they do not exchange women, how do they maintain a unified social structure? They exchange services. The Tarthar own the sacred dairies, while the Tevali work in them. The binary opposition remains, but the mechanism of exchange shifts from marriage to labor. A key takeaway from Levi-Strauss is that social identities are inherently oppositional. You cannot have an identity in a vacuum. You are always something with respect to someone else. A person is a teacher only in relation to a student. A cabinet secretary holds that identity at the office with their staff, but at home they are a parent to their child. This oppositional nature directly reflects the human mind's tendency to organize the world into binary opposites. Furthermore, the boundaries between these oppositional identities are completely arbitrary and fluid. They shift depending on the context. For instance, two people from different states might view each other as opposites in a local dispute. But if they travel abroad, those regional boundaries dissolve, and they suddenly identify as alike, united by their shared national identity against a new other. The line of demarcation is never permanently fixed. Seriously, this brings us to a fundamental cultural rule, the incest taboo. Levi-Strauss viewed the incest taboo not just as a moral guideline, but as the ultimate expression of binary opposition. It divides the world into two groups, those who are alike and therefore prohibited for sexual union, and those who are distinct, making them permitted partners. This distinction forces individuals to look outside their immediate group to find a mate. Levi-Strauss famously called the incest taboo a pre-social social fact. This means it is a rule that existed even before formal societies were formed. Because early humans could not mate within their own group due to this taboo, they were forced to exchange women with other distinct groups. This ordered exchange created the very first alliances and networks. In essence, the incest taboo is the catalyst that built human society. To understand why this exchange is so powerful, Levi-Strauss drew upon Marcel Mauss's concept of the gift. Mauss noted that giving a gift creates an obligation to reciprocate, forging a friendship. While groups can exchange words or goods, Mauss and Levi-Strauss argued that in early societies, women were considered the supreme form of gift. Exchanging women ensured the survival and continuation of the group, thereby creating the strongest, most enduring social bonds possible. Let us shift our focus to another kinship structure, the avunculate. This refers to the specific relationship between a person, referred to in anthropology as the ego, and their maternal uncle. Levi-Strauss observed that this relationship cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a broader structural system of attitudes within the family that, once again, operates on the logic of binary opposites. He discovered a fascinating inverse relationship in family dynamics. If the relationship between the ego and the maternal uncle is warm, familiar, and easygoing, then the relationship between the ego and the father will inevitably be formal, strict, and disciplined. Conversely, if the father is the warm and familiar figure, the maternal uncle takes on the strict, feared role. The human mind balances these family roles as opposing binaries. This pattern of inverse attitudes extends to the adults as well. Levi-Strauss noted that the relationship between a husband and wife is inversely related to the relationship between that wife and her brother. If the marriage is highly formal and restricted, the bond between the brother and sister will be liberal and familiar.
If the marriage is warm and cozy, the sibling relationship becomes more formal. The structure always maintains this binary balance. Moving beyond kinship, Levi-Strauss applied structuralism to totemism. He agreed with earlier anthropologists that totems are emblems of a clan, but he argued their true purpose is structural. Totems are essentially linguistic classificatory devices. They're tools used by the human mind to categorize and order social relationships between different groups, allowing them to navigate complex social landscapes. Totemism perfectly illustrates the binary opposition between nature and culture. When a social group, which is a product of human culture, needs an emblem to represent itself, it looks to its opposite, nature. They choose a natural entity, like an animal or a plant, to symbolize their cultural identity. This choice is not random. It is a direct reflection of the mind's tendency to organize the world into contrasting pairs. The specific animal or plant chosen as a totem is highly deliberate. Levi-Strauss argued that the relationship between the chosen natural species mirrors the relationship between the human groups. For example, if two clans live in the same forest, but one is politically dominant and the other subordinate, they might choose the lion and the deer as their respective totems. The natural hierarchy reflects their cultural reality. Why was totemism necessary in the first place? In very simple early societies, people lived highly similar lives. They hunted the same way, spoke the same language, and had no distinct markers. But remember, society requires exchange, and you cannot have exchange without distinct groups. Totems solved this by creating arbitrary but necessary boundaries. By adopting different totems, a uniform population divided itself into distinct groups, making the exchange of women, and thus society, possible. To explain why women were the ones exchanged between these newly formed totemic groups, Levi-Strauss introduced a highly controversial androcentric idea. He argued that in early societies, men controlled cultural institutions, while women, due to childbirth, were seen as closer to nature. Because women were viewed as naturally equivalent and lacking a rigid cultural identity, they could easily rotate between groups. This movement is what wove the separate clans into a cohesive society. However, as societies became more complex, this dynamic shifted. In systems like the Indian caste system, women developed strong cultural and caste identities. They were no longer viewed as naturally equivalent, meaning they could not simply be exchanged across caste lines. Instead, the structural need for exchange was met through the division of labor. Different castes began exchanging specialized services with one another, maintaining the binary structure and social unity through a different mechanism. We will see how this structural logic applies to the analysis of myth shortly. Let's dive right into the structural analysis of myth. According to structuralists like Levi-Strauss, mythological stories across all cultures reflect a fundamental human thinking pattern. We think in binary opposites. Myths essentially exist to provide a midpoint, a solution to the conflict between these polar ideas that our brains naturally perceive. Levi-Strauss compared myths to language. Just as a language is built from small sound units or letters, like the 26 alphabets in English, that can be rearranged into infinite words, myths are composed of small, indivisible units called mythemes. By arranging and rearranging these limited mythemes, mythmakers create what appear to be entirely different stories. There are two main elements to any myth. First is the sequence, which is simply the series of events, the chronological story of what happens. Second is the schema, which is how those events are organized and arranged. It is the schema, the underlying pattern of arrangement, that actually gives a myth its unique meaning and reflects the structural thinking of the human mind. Because the human mind can only conceive a limited number of binary oppositions, there are a limited number of mythemes. Therefore, two seemingly dissimilar myths are often just variations of one another. You can see this by applying basic transformations, converting a positive outcome to a negative one, reversing the chronological order of events, or swapping the gender of the protagonist, like the classic Cinderella story being mirrored by the Ashboy myth. Let's look at the famous Oedipus myth, which Levi-Strauss analyzed extensively in his book Mythologicals. The story involves a prophecy that Oedipus will kill his father, King Lauus. Despite efforts to avoid this fate, Oedipus unknowingly kills his father, defeats the monstrous Sphinx, and marries his biological mother, Jocasta, leading to tragic consequences and the violation of deep cultural taboos. When we break down the Oedipus myth into mythemes, we uncover clear binary opposites. We see honor versus shame through the violation of the incest taboo. We see life versus death in the killings within the family. Order versus disorder is reflected in the battle for the kingdom. And finally, nature versus culture is perfectly symbolized by the monstrous Sphinx representing untamed nature and Oedipus representing human culture. These mythemes aren't isolated to Greece. Look at Indian mythology. The conflict between father and son is mirrored in the story of Lord Ganesha, and the uncle-nephew dynamic is seen with Kans and Krishna. We also see universal mythemes in creation stories, like the sacrifice of a primordial being in the Indian Purusha Sukta and the Norse myth of Ymir, or the global flood narratives of Manu and the Matsya avatar paralleling Noah's Ark. Another major analysis by Levi-Strauss is the Native American myth of Asdiwal. It begins with two starving widows during a winter famine. A magical bird brings food and fathers a child, Asdiwal. Asdiwal journeys to the heavens, marries the evening star, and returns to Earth with inexhaustible baskets of food, only to eventually lose his social bonds through betrayal. Levi-Strauss highlighted 4 distinct levels of binary opposition in the Asdiwal myth. Geographically, we see contrasts like land versus river. Techno-economically, the story moves from severe deficit, a single rotten berry, to massive surplus. Cosmologically, it contrasts the earthly realm with the heavenly realm of the gods. And sociologically, it explores the tension between patrilocal and matrilocal residence patterns. We can even apply this to massive epic poems. The abduction of Helen in the Trojan War structurally mirrors the abduction of Sita in the Ramayana. Furthermore, the Greek hero Achilles and the Indian hero Karna share identical mythemes. Both are warned by their mothers not to fight, both have a specific physical vulnerability, and the death of both heroes ultimately signals the end of their respective great wars. Moving forward, we meet Edmund Leach, often called the Anglophone purveyor of structuralism. Because Levi-Strauss wrote in highly abstract French, his ideas were initially inaccessible to many. Leach, who had traveled to China and studied under Malinowski, conducted fieldwork among the Kachin in Burma. He was instrumental in bringing structuralist thought to the English-speaking anthropological community. Leach argued that what we apprehend about the external world is heavily dictated by how our brains are wired. The natural world exists as a continuum. Time flows continuously and space has no natural borders. However, the human mind tends to cut this continuum into discrete segments. We draw imaginary lines to separate cities, and we categorize the continuous spectrum of light into distinct bands of color in a rainbow. Building on this, Leach stated that we think in the form of opposites and mediation. We create binary opposites, like negative and positive, but to resolve the tension between them, we create a mediating category. In mathematics, this is the number 0. 0 is neither positive nor negative, yet it connects the two. It serves to bridge the gap between polar extremes. You can see this mediation everywhere. In classifying animals, we have domesticated and wild, with creeping pests acting as the mediator, living in our homes but untamed. In our houses, we have strictly public spaces and strictly private spaces, with areas like the kitchen acting as a mediator between clean and dirty. Even in politics, socialism acts as a mediating category between the polar opposites of pure capitalism and pure communism. Leach applied this brilliantly to the concept of time. Time is a social construct. Nature didn't invent the month of January. To perceive time, we cut it into intervals using markers. Rituals and festivals act as the mediating category between the past and the present. By doing something unusual, like cutting a birthday cake, we create a structural marker that officially ends one phase of life and begins a new one. In cosmology, humans invent structures to bridge the world of lived experience and the world of imagination. The temple or church is the mediating space. It exists on Earth, but follows different, sacred rules. Furthermore, the gods themselves act as mediators between nature and culture. Deities like Ganesha, Durga, or Zeus combine human cultural forms with raw natural elements, or animal companions, linking the two realms. Leach even analyzed traffic signals to prove his point. We took a continuous spectrum of light and selected 2 absolute extremes, red and green, to represent the binary opposites of stop and go. But because we needed a way to transition between these absolute commands, we introduced a mediating category, the yellow light, instructing us to slow down, perfectly reflecting our structural thinking pattern. To wrap up our discussion on structuralism, both Levi-Strauss and Edmund Leach showed us that human culture is not random. Whether it's ancient mythology, the layout of our homes, or the way we celebrate a new year, our minds naturally organize the world into binary opposites. By creating mediating categories to resolve these tensions, we construct the complex, structured reality that we call culture.